Hi, welcome to the channel. My name is Richard and I'm the Bull Rider. And today I'm going to tell you everything that you need to know on how to perform a compression test on your car. And this test is so awesome because it tells you so much about the general health of your motor. And it also tells you, with a couple tips and tricks, which component might be failing in your motor. And there are more specialized tests, such as a leak down test, that will tell you a little bit more in depth which component in specific is failing. But for something that you can do at home and skip the mechanic, the compression test beats out all of those by far. And all you need for this is a compression tester. And this is so cool because you can get this at any auto parts store. You can actually rent it, or you can get it online for pretty cheap. All it is a hose, a check valve, and a pressure gauge. So all a motor really is a glorified air compressor. It takes air in, compresses it, ignites it, and then shoots it out the exhaust. So air going into the motor and air coming out of the motor are controlled by these things called valves. But during the compression stroke, both these valves letting air into the motor and letting air out of the motor are closed. So during the compression stroke, the air is actually compressed inside the cylinder. So as the piston goes up the cylinder, it actually compresses the air inside the cylinder, and then at the right time, it ignites it with the spark plug. And what we're actually doing today with the compression tester is we're actually measuring the amount of pressure that's produced during the compression stroke. And that will tell us a lot of things. It will tell us how well our piston rings are sealing, and it will also tell us how well our valves are sealing. So if we have good sealing valves and we have good sealing pistons, we have a good, healthy motor. So I'm gonna recommend that you perform a compression test on a motor cold. And I recommend this for one reason, because when the motor heats up, the tolerances on a lot of components actually become a lot tighter, and it might obfuscate a lot of the results that we might not see comparative to a cold compression test. So this test is really simple because all we need to do is take the spark plugs out, disable the fuel system, and then crank the motor over to see what the compression number is. First, we need to pull this frame rail out, pull the coil pack cover plate off, remove the coil packs by first disconnecting them and then pulling them out of the housing. Now we can loosen up the spark plugs. Then we can remove the spark plugs off the cylinder head on all the cylinders. I'm just using a magnet to pull them off. On the right side of the engine, we have to move the coolant reservoir and then also get at the bracket that's underneath it so we can get at the spark plugs. Then we can pull the cover plate off for this side. Then we can disconnect the coil packs and remove them from the car. And then we can pull the spark plugs on this bank as well. Right, so now we're gonna unplug the fuel injectors. And what this is gonna do is prevent any gas from getting into our cylinders. And since we don't have spark plugs or coil packs, we don't want a bunch of unburnt gas going into our cylinders not being combusted, because we're just cranking it over and we'd just be left with a bunch of gas in our cylinders. So I'm gonna unplug all of these and then we can crank it over after we install the tool. Now we can install the compression tester hose. And we can hand tighten it till it's snug just on the hose, just like that. And then attach the gauge. And now we're gonna hop in the car and turn the motor over until we hear it turn over 5 to 7 times. And since we don't have any spark plugs in any of the cylinders, the only compression being produced is in the cylinder that has the compression tester in it. So we'll actually be able to hear the compression in the motor as we're turning over the motor. And then we can look at the gauge and see what happens. So that first cylinder that we just tested had a compression of about 150 PSI. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna test all the other cylinders and write down all the numbers. Then we're gonna test 2 other engines and see what the compression numbers are on those. Is this car any different from any other car that we're gonna test? And then we're gonna come back and look at all the data and see what all these numbers really actually mean. So we start again by pulling the coil pack out, pulling the spark plug out, unplugging all the injectors on the fuel rail, install your compression tester hose, and install the gauge. And on this 250,000 mile Audi belt-driven V8, we're about 155 PSI. And then last, we can test the compression in this little twin turbo Audi V6 and see what the result is. And this one's reading about 120 odd PSI. So I got all the numbers, now we can look at them and compare all of them. So looking at the Gallardo, we have about 150 PSI all across the board. The Audi V8 is about the same, 151, 150, so on and so forth. But when we're looking at the twin turbo Audi V6, we're only getting a compression of like 127 PSI or like 125 at the lowest. What's going on here? So when we tested these three motors, you might notice that the Lamborghini V10 and the Audi V8 are sitting at a compression of about 150 psi, but the V6 is only sitting at about 127 psi. And it has to do with this thing called compression ratio. So every motor, depending on its design, has different compression ratio. And a compression ratio is basically a ratio of volumes. So when the piston in the cylinder goes all the way to the bottom of the motor, all the way at bottom dead center, there's a volume of air that's displaced inside that cylinder. And then when the piston goes all the way to the top of the cylinder, there's still a little bit of air in there. There's the air on the top of this piston because it's a little bit dished inside of it. And then there's the air inside the cylinder head itself because it kind of cups in just a little bit. And the compression ratio is basically just a ratio of those two volumes using a special formula. The compression ratio will tell us how much during the compression stroke that air will actually get squeezed down. And it will tell us how much we should be seeing on our gauge. So by knowing the compression ratio and by knowing atmospheric pressure where you live, you'll know what the ideal compression number you're supposed to get for your motor when you test it. So let's go back to the drawing board and I'll show you a simple formula that you need to know to figure out the ideal compression for any motor that you're working on whatsoever. So you're gonna have to excuse my handwriting, but the formula for ideal compression is the compression ratio. And you can find this online for any motor. Just Google the motor that you have and the year of it, and you'll find the compression ratio. And then it's times the atmospheric pressure. But as we go up in altitude, the pressure changes because the air gets thinner. So depending on where you live, I live at 2,000 feet. Depending on where you live, the air pressure is going to be different. So you're going to have to consider where you live in relation to what the actual atmospheric pressure is. So the ideal compression for the Gallardo is going to be the compression ratio, which is 11, times the atmospheric where I live in PSI, which is 13.7, and that equals 150.7. Let's do the Audi V8. So we have the ideal compression, which is the compression ratio, and for this Audi V8, it's 11 again, and then times 13.7 equals 150.7. Now, what about this Audi twin turbo V6? The ideal compression equals 9.3 times 13.7, which equals 127 psi. So comparing our ideal compression that we calculated to what the actual compression is on the motor, we can see that this motor is in really good health. All the cylinders are really close and there's no variance whatsoever. Same with the Audi V8, we calculated that it has an ideal compression of about 150.7 psi. And the same with this, it all tests across the board. This one might have been a little bit inaccurate due to my testing method. And same with the twin turbo Audi V6. Even though all of our numbers are a lot lower than the other cars, you can see that when we calculate the ideal compression, all of the numbers that we're looking at are almost perfect comparative to the ideal compression that we should be getting at our altitude and compression ratio. So one last thing we need to do to ensure that we have a healthy motor is make sure that there's no variance between the cylinders. So if we have a variance in compression on like one cylinder that's reading really low comparative to the highest one of 15% or more, that's a good indication that we have a problem in just that one cylinder that's reading really low. But if we are seeing a low compression result in one cylinder, go ahead and run the compression test on that cylinder again and make sure that it's not the compression tester that's at fault and it's actually the cylinder that's at fault. And there's one trick that we can use to determine if it's the piston rings that are sealing improperly or if it's the valves that are sealing improperly. So what we're gonna do is a wet compression test. And this basically involves putting about a tablespoon of engine oil inside your cylinder. And what this does is it allows the oil to actually seal up any air gaps that might be present on the piston rings themselves or on the cylinder walls. If your compression numbers do increase after doing the wet compression test, that's a good indication that you have issues with your piston rings or your cylinder walls as opposed to your valves. And the same goes for if you have low compression on all cylinders. If you perform a wet compression test and your compression numbers do rise, that's a good indication that you just have a generally worn out motor and it's likely due for a rebuild. You might have low compression on one cylinder and then you might have low compression on the cylinder right next to it. And that's a good indication of a head gasket leak, and it allows air during the compression stroke to leak over into an adjacent cylinder and then cause you to have a lower compression result in both cylinders. There are more advanced tests such as a leak down test that will allow you to determine specifically if it's the intake valves or the exhaust valves that are leaking. And there are other advanced tests that will allow you to determine if you do have a head gasket issue, but that's discourse for another video. But if you like this video, please consider giving it a like, and until next time, thanks.